you. So welcome everyone. So apprenticeship myth busting. There are lots of misconceptions about apprenticeships out in the market for lots of reasons. But GBS apprenticeships have been in the apprenticeship field for the last 5 years, and actually have been we've been established since 2010. So our market is digital marketing and business skills. And business skills it is a whole array of different particular skills that any business would need, such as HR, recruitment, business admin, customer service, management. And I'm sure as we go through the interview today, Paul will draw some more information out of what is available to you. So Paul, talk me through some of your questions. What do the audience want to know today?
I've tried to incorporate from an employer and learner perspective, Penny, in terms of what's required, who needs to do what, how they're funded, how you can find out more about apprenticeships, hopefully covering the whole learner journey or the whole apprenticeship journey from start to finish, or I've tried to anyway, and asking questions kind of throughout that journey to clarify, hopefully, the myths that surround apprenticeships.
Brilliant. So let's get started. What's your first question, Paul, regarding apprenticeships?
Who are modern day apprenticeships aimed at?
Oh, wow. Okay. So traditionally, I think apprenticeships are very much aimed at and actually believed to be for just school leavers. And they're not anymore. They are for anyone of any age, depending on their role and responsibilities. And they are really aimed at people who are new into a role, not necessarily new into the world of work. So that could be someone that's transitioning from being perhaps a admin assistant to suddenly becoming a team leader for the first time, or someone that's a team leader that's going to that departmental manager role. Or equally, it can still be, and it is very much focused on young people as well who leave school, but give them those skills at level 2. And there are lots of levels, and they start at level 2 and they go straight through to level 7, which is masters. So in leadership and management, there is a level 7, and actually a lot of IT ones now, there are level 7s. So they're for any age and any role. So the belief that they're just for school people, school leavers, is gone. It's an understanding of what they're about. When we say new apprenticeships, because you said what are the modern apprenticeships, it's quite an old phrase that, so we are recording, so I will refer to that, is traditionally most people of my age would remember apprenticeships as leaving school, doing a BTEC, which was a knowledge qualification, doing a competency qualification, which was my skills, and doing maths and English, and going to college 1 day a week, and doing lots of little qualifications that my own training provider or college would tick off as they went along what I'd achieved. But round about nearly 5 years ago, probably now, if not a little bit longer, the government introduced a fantastic initiative, and they went from what we call an apprenticeship framework to apprenticeship standard. And the difference is the old framework was made up of lots of qualifications. In an apprenticeship standard, these have been designed by employers themselves. So employers decided what knowledge, skills, and behaviours they needed in very specific roles. And you can still, till today, as an employer, if you've got a group of 10 employers or more that can demonstrate that there's a need in the market for a very specific apprenticeship, employers can still apply to actually design a new apprenticeship. So the world of apprenticeships has developed significantly, so that employers are now leading it and saying what they want in an apprenticeship. So it's now a 2-part journey for learners. The first part is being on programme, and the second part is to be assessed at the end by an independent organisation called an endpoint assessment organisation. And they're graded now. They were never graded. So they used to just be a pass. Now they're a pass, a merit, or a distinction. So there's a huge difference that people can see the effort they've put in makes a difference at the end based on their grade. So that's the difference. Does that answer the question for you, Paul?
It does. It answers a lot of the next ones I've got as well, Penny, because you, in true Penny fashion, you've rolled into an expansive answer.
So give me the next question. What was the next question?
The next question was, how have apprenticeships changed over the years?
Okay, I can still go into a bit more detail. So apprenticeships have changed where when we talked about old frameworks, you were very much, oh, what are the optional units? What can I pick? And they were quite restrictive in terms of what you could and couldn't do with a young person. There was no creativity in them. In the new standards, the learner starts as a starting point and what we call a gateway point into that end point assessment where they're graded. But in that start to the gateway, we call it on program. And as an employer now, even though there's a set apprenticeship with a set of knowledge, skills, and behaviours that the learner needs to achieve and demonstrate, the idea of the new apprenticeship is you invite your providers in and say, this is what we want as an employer. These are the skills that we want. And this is the software we deliver it on, or this is the system that we use. And your training providers are now required to design that specific journey for your learner around what you do as a business. And as an employer, you're now in that driving seat. You are telling your providers what to do, not providers coming along and saying, well, this is what we do and that's it. So a great employer will really test their provider, say, well, that doesn't meet our needs, but what we need is design me something, come back and show me what you're going to deliver. And that's value for money. So that's the huge difference.
We talked about standards briefly already then, Penny. Can you tell me about standards and how they're different from the old frameworks?
Okay, so frameworks, again, are made up of different qualifications, where standards is all you've got to make sure is at the end of the learner's journey on program that they have that knowledge, they can demonstrate the skills, and they consistently demonstrate the behaviours that are listed in that apprenticeship. But the difference is, as an employer that we've said, you get to design it. You also get the opportunity to design how it will be delivered with your provider. So, for example, some of our employers have people all over the country, but they want a standardised approach for all, say, their digital marketers or their departmental managers. So what we do is we create with them their programme, and it's delivered in modules throughout the year, but it's also recorded. So a learner can go back and recap on that. Equally, if on one month, say month 3, actually it's not going to be remote, it's not going to be a webinar, it's going to be a face-to-face workshop, and that's what we've agreed with the employer, it's still there's still a recording backup. So for whatever reason, COVID, we found that huge in the last, haven't we, in the 18 months, it's been a huge block for many learners, or they just can't get because of transport or their shift changes at short notice, not to worry, because they can go online, they can still have the same learning experience, but from an online perspective, and an individual coach will go and coach them. So it's about flexibilities in standards, and you as an employer driving what flexibilities you want. Do you want it on site? Do you want it blended? Do you want a little bit of added value in there? So, for example, in our leadership programs, and we do this in the IT ones as well, is a lot of our employers say, I want CMI, I want everybody to be accredited CMI. Well, under the apprenticeship standards, we can't pay for them to do a qualification if the apprenticeship doesn't say the qualifications in it. However, as part of your endpoint assessment process, those employers that have picked CMI offer a support package that has all the support materials in for the apprenticeship. Equally, CMI will also accredit the learner at the end for the CMI diploma or CMI certificate if the learner has met the requirements along the way. So they get international accreditation as well as UK-based accreditation in the form of the apprenticeship. So it's about pick and mix.
But how are apprenticeships funded, and does it cost me anything?
Oh, right. Okay. This is the big question, isn't it? They're funded in so many different ways. But for an employer, there's 2 things that you need to focus on. Do I pay into the levy or do I not pay into the levy? Either way, there's a fee. So if you're paying into the levy, you've already paid it. So the levy is where your payroll is £3 million or more a year, and then they pay a percentage of that into a levy pot. And some employers might have 50p in the levy pot, some might have a couple of million. So it doesn't matter how much is in your levy pot, that's how we access the funding for you. If you're not levy, you're obviously not paying into a levy pot, so you don't have the luxury of having something in a pot, or others say you don't have the disadvantage of paying the government a levy that you may or may not use. But how you work it is everybody accesses the funding requests through a system. So you request your funding for the individuals through your digital apprenticeship service called DAS. Bit of terminology, everybody there, so apologies. If I'm getting into terminology that's foreign world, Paul will rein me in. But it's just like a platform, and it's linked between the funding agents who pay us as a provider and the HMRC where the money sits. So what happens is, regardless of whether you're levy or non-levy, as a provider, it pays us through that system. But as a levy, in theory, the money's there. As a non-levy, you're asking the government to give you some money towards that apprentice, and it's there, and you can draw it. It's a straight click of a button. I've done it many times for for employers. But the difference is, if you're not paying into the levy, you have to pay a 5% contribution towards the cost of the apprenticeship. So, for example, if the funding for the apprenticeship, let's look at a team leader. The funding drawdown is 4,500. So your 5% contribution, if you don't pay into the levy, would be £225. Yeah, and we don't take it in one lump sum. We take it on programme as the learners on programme. So, and the the funding agent, I'll call them the funding agent because they change the name every 3 years. The funding agent will then, agency will then tell us every month if you've got some contribution to pay. So it's either I contribute 5% or I'm funding it through the levy if I'm a levy employer. But there's another little trick to know is if that you're recruiting a 16 to 18-year-old and you have less than 50 employees, there's no contribution whatsoever. There's also some incentives. I'm not sure how long they'll last, but if you are recruiting someone new into your business to do an apprenticeship, there's a grant that you draw down through the system, and we help employers do it all the time, up to £4,000 for taking on someone in an apprenticeship. And that doesn't matter if they're a team leader, a data analyst, or a cyber specialist, or whether they're a customer service apprenticeship. Doesn't matter how old they are. If you bring them into the business, it's £3,000 grant. If they're 16 to 18, you get another £1,000 grant. So the government are paying you to take on people into apprenticeships, but it's only for new starters, not for people who are already on payroll. Does that answer?
It's almost creating that role for that apprenticeship, isn't it, Penny, in terms of the incentive?
Yeah. But you can't have someone say, for example, Paul, if our CEO came to you and said, oh, I want you to do Penny's job, and she's off on another jolly around the world, and you're going to go into it, it's going to be an apprenticeship so you can get some training along the way. It doesn't count because you're already with the business and you're already on payroll.
What sort of timescales are involved in completing an apprenticeship?
A minimum of 372 days for the training for any apprenticeship. And then you have between 3 and 6 months for endpoint assessment. So I'd say a minimum of 15 months for any apprenticeship. But that depends on the level and the type of apprenticeship. So, for example, for a cyber specialist at level 3, the recommendation is 18 months. But we might look at that individual and think, you know what, they're quite savvy. They've already got a little bit of experience. They're in the role. It actually is only going to take them 12 months. So we base it on the individual rather than the recommended time. But the minimum time period someone should be on programme is 372 days before going into endpoint assessment. Don't ask me why 372 rather than a year. I don't know. I really couldn't tell you.
Year plus a week, isn't it?
Yeah.
Randomly. So how is the apprenticeship undertaken or delivered?
That's down to you as an employer. So you can either do it day release, and that can be done remotely. If you've only got one learner and you don't want them to go anywhere, and they can be in the workplace and do that remotely, or the coach will come in. Or you can do it through workshops if there's a cohort of people. Or equally, you can do it blended. So many workshops over the years, so many sessions by webinar, but it's down to, as an employer, what their capability is for hosting training if we've not got a local site, or if they've not got a local site to train. We adapt to the employer. So, but we do actually also look for local sites. So we have one client in London that we don't have a training facility in London. That would be far too expensive when half the time nobody's there. So we have a couple of employers in there that bring their learners together into one cohort, and we organise a venue ourselves and pay for that as part of the funding, and they all come to a venue. And then for others, we might go to the employer's site. So it all depends. So it can be day release, it can be a week, it can be so many block hours a month, or it can be so many hours a day. So I have one employer that says, oh, 20% off the job, it's a lot. So can we break that down by the day? Yeah, an hour and 15 minutes a day studying, that meets your 20%.
Is there a minimum expectation or a frequency of how many times the apprentices are visited?
Again, that's down to the programme and the style of the programme. So really our tutors should be touching base with them as a minimum once a fortnight, on a one-to-one coaching basis. And that might be, for some it might be, hi, Teams call, hi, getting on, okay, let's walk through that. Compared to the next time they see them, it might be on site to coach them and mentor them about how they're implementing that in the workplace. But again, that is down to the individual choice of the actual employer.
So what is covered during them sessions?
So covered is the knowledge, mainly, the knowledge that they require.
Is that work that the apprentice provides, is that assessed?
No, we can't assess because they are graded at the end independently, but it is, we guide them and support them to make sure they're working towards the best possible grade.
What's, from a learner's perspective then, Penny, what evidence or work is produced by that apprentice?
That depends again on the apprenticeship. So for example, if you take a recruitment consultant, that would be through observations, through discussions, through witness testimonies, through case studies, based on what they need to evidence as part of their knowledge, skills and behaviours. And then for an IT learner, it might be very focused activities that they have to do observations and present knowledge that they've completed an activity.
How does that work need to be provided, and where's it stored?
So that's usually provided by the learner, and they have an online platform where they interact with their work and their assignments, and they load it up so that the learner can see it, and actually the employer can see it as well.
As a learner, will I need to complete maths and English?
So, okay, this is the $1 million question, mainly for our adult learners. If you can't evidence you've done maths and English at grade C and above previously, then we will support you to achieve that on programme.
So, as an employer, do I need to be involved?
Absolutely. So your involvement is critical. You've got to support the programme, so you've got to help us in terms of what you want to achieve out of it yourself. There has to be return on investment because you are releasing them for the time off the job, which is 20% off the job. So 20% of their time should really be studying towards the programme, and that's in different forms. But as an employer, you need to commit that this person is learning along the way and give them time to study.
How much time is involved or required to complete the apprenticeship?
Again, that depends on the apprenticeship, but we recommend a minimum of 15 months on programme to make sure they are studying at a reasonable rate and able to implement it in their workplace and evidence that it's having an impact.
Touched upon it already, Penny, you've mentioned it a couple of times. What is the 20% off the job and how is that covered?
Okay, it is a funding rule, and the learners should be spending 20% of their time studying to develop their skills. And that's not necessarily time with us. That could be some research, it could be buddying with a colleague, it could be learning something new in the workplace. But we plan with the employer right at the beginning what that looks like for the whole journey. So everybody knows where they stand in terms of what's expected along the way.
So from an employer's point of view, does this mean the apprentice is off their job for 20% of their time at work?
Yes and no. So, for example, if they're in a one-to-one with their line manager, getting some feedback on their performance and discussing, how the job's going, that's off the job because they're not physically doing the job. If they're in a meeting or they're buddying with somebody else and, to experience, say, for example, delivering appraisals or experiencing how to set a network up, because it's not physically their day-to-day job because they're learning it, then that is classed as off the job. On the job will be where I'm physically unsupervised delivering an appraisal and I've not got anyone to give me feedback on. And then other off the jobs is obviously time with ourselves and time in the programme.
How is the apprenticeship completed or signed off?
So old world would be, as a training provider, we sign it off. And there's some pros and cons to that. So some providers will sign things off old world in frameworks. The idea of new world in terms of apprenticeship standards is, as a provider, we can't sign you off. An endpoint assessment organisation will sign you as complete and grade you as part of that end assessment, which each apprenticeships are different. So if we look at, for example, customer service is a very basic one. They are assessed through a showcase piece of all their best work, an observation and an interview. Whereas team leaders and team leaders are assessed through a knowledge test, a portfolio of evidence against certain skill sets, a CPD record to reflect on what they've done, and a competency interview where they have to give examples of how they've demonstrated it and present evidence. But on a level 5, it's the same as team leader, but they do a project, a live project in the workplace. So every apprenticeship is different. But the point is, as a training provider, we can't sign them off anymore and say, wow, our training was amazing, you're all distinction, which was very old world. No grades, though, old world, but say you could pass them. We can't now. And that is what I love about the new world. As providers, we no longer get to say we've passed. So we have to do our absolute best job to make sure you are ready. So, for example, I think one of the companies in the Hive 360 group at the moment, and I'm speaking a little bit out of turn, but they've all just had their results and they all got distinction. And that's a reflection on their hard work.
What is gateway?
Oh, gateway. Well, I imagine when you say that, I imagine a little gate in a field, and that's literally what it is. So that's where we talk about being on 2 parts of the apprenticeship, being on programme learning and getting ready for endpoint assessment where you're graded. The gateway is where the apprentice, us as a training provider and the employer all agree together that they're ready to go for endpoint assessment grading. So there's an agreement there. And that's what we call gateway.
You've virtually answered it already, Penny, through your in-depth response to previous questions, but what is endpoint assessment, EPA?
So endpoint assessment, as I've said previously, it's assessing you at the end independently, 100%. There's no sampling. It's 100% of all the work, and it's where you are assessed against different methods to decide whether you are a pass, a merit, or a distinction. Now there is a fail option, so it's not always a pass. It should always be a distinction, but there is that opportunity for you to be failed, and that shouldn't happen because the gateway's there where the provider is saying, I believe you're ready, the learner is saying, I am ready, and the employer says, I'm happy with that, let's move into endpoint assessment.
So who is that EPA undertaken with?
They're only approved organisations through Ofqual. So Ofqual is the organisation that looks after all the awarding bodies who create, develop and accredit qualifications.
And as an employer, can I choose? How do we choose?
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off there because I feel quite strong about this. A lot of providers will say, oh, use CMI or use Skills First or use BCS. There are hundreds of them, and employers will say to us, who should I use? Well, we can't tell you who to use, but we can guide you to who's on the list, who we've previously used, their performance rates, and there's that opportunity to select with some guidance. But we can't choose for you as an employer. That's against the funding rules.
And final question then, Penny. As an employer, how do I source or identify what apprenticeships are available to me?
Sometimes it can be a challenge, knowing because there's over 600 now on the system that are approved. Is the best way is to determine what role do you need in your business, and then working with a training provider to decide what's the best apprenticeship for you. So a good example of that is project manager. A lot of people go into roles that there's not an apprenticeship for, but they're doing a lot of project work. So associate project manager at level 4 is a great one for that. So it's not always clear which is the right apprenticeship. Sometimes you need that guidance from your training provider. Focus on the role and the skills that you want, and ask your apprenticeship provider to guide you on what's the right apprenticeship.
Fabulous.
Okay, fine.
You'll perhaps be glad to know, Penny, that's the end of my quizzing.
I think sometimes with those, there's a lot of information for people to digest. There's a lot goes on in apprenticeships, and it's always useful that if you want a little bit more information that's specific to you as an employer, it's just to have that informal chat. I know you're not a salesperson, Paul. I'm not. We are apprenticeship people. We're delivery people. We intentionally don't invite our sales team onto these calls because it would be a very different webinar completely. It would be very, very different call completely. And I think if anyone that wants to know about some very specific topics could look at the schedule that you've put together, Paul, with High 360 at Skills Academy to look at specific ones. So I know you've got ones on recruitment, you've got ones on leadership and management. I think you've got some IT ones as well. So they're more specific. They're not general like this. They talk about the actual sector and what the apprenticeship does and the sort of skills that it might cover. So that's one thing to go to. Definitely pick the right sector for you. You could ask for a brochure or just ask for a chat with a little bit more information about you as a business. But it is about understanding you as a business and what you want to do and why you want the apprenticeships. What we don't want to hear is, I just want to use my levy. Well, that's great, but why do you want to use your levy? Make sure you're using it effectively and make sure you're using it for the right reasons. We all want to use our levy because it's the government taking the money off us. But we need to make sure that it's invested properly for you as a business, because you've got that 20% off the job. And it is a valuable 20% because it's about improving people to help your business to continue to build and be effective in their position in the market. So now I know we've got a couple of people that have we've lost connection with, but some people have come back on. So I'm going to stop the recording now so that any questions can be more personal to the individual participants. But thank you everyone for joining. Give me a couple of minutes and we'll switch off the recording.